Greetings. This is Phil Amerson with the To Be and Do podcast, a part of the Belonging Exchange. We're in a season when a lot of thinking and some action needs to begin to go on to address the rather flagrant racism that's being being dropped upon, imposed upon, um, dividing our nation. Uh, it was astonishing in my world that as after the tragedy in Washington, D.C. a few months ago, when the helicopter and the plane crashed at Reagan Airport, and immediately after, the President of the United States said that the problem was the control tower office officials had been hired according to DEI. It was his way of saying, we should have never let those Black people or those Hispanic people have the equal opportunity to jobs. We can't trust them. They're the reason. And of course, the truth is, that's not true. Almost 3 or 4 times a week, there is some attack that is just beneath the surface, but sometimes right in your face, an attack on people of color in this country. Now, it's coming out of fear. We are a nation that is multicultural. We are a nation of many races and many peoples and many religions. That's already the case. And many people live afraid of that, what I call the great multicultural future. It's one of the things that the United States could do for the future of all humanity, and that is to live fully into who we are as a nation, that all are created equal. Or in scriptures, there's Paul in Galatians who speaks about the church, the people of the early church, as not divided by male or female, by Jew or Greek. Uh, all are part of the body. Or, of course, the many stories from the Gospels about the Samaritans or about the Ethiopians or about the non-Judeans who are part of this God movement that we are all called to be a part of. Back in 1971, I had the great privilege of doing graduate education. I studied at Emory University with Jackson Carroll and Earl Brewer. They were both sociologists of religion. And we ended up having resources provided, ironically, by the Irwin Sweeney Miller Foundation, a foundation that was really funded by the work of Irwin Miller, J. Irwin Miller, out of Columbus, Indiana, the Cummins Engine Company people. It was called Project Understanding. And it was to help us understand better why racism is in our society and what the churches might do to address it. And so I was a young graduate student. There I was now, what is that, 55 years ago? And I learned a lot about racism. I came into it thinking, I think like many in our nation think, racism is an attitude one holds. It's an attitude of bigotry. It's an attitude of discrimination. Uh, it's just, I'm against somebody because they're Black or because they're Hispanic. Well, there is attitudinal racism, and some of it is pretty raw, pretty rough. It's just based on ugly bigotry. Some of my friends call it redneck racism. And unfortunately, uh, that I think diminishes redneck folks, good, hardworking farm people. It's no more among farm people than it is among suburban people. It's just different. Because racism, you see, is more than an attitude. It's also a behavior. How do you behave? And what in your experience lets you know a person who is different? I confess that I grew up in southern Indiana. I lived in Columbus. That's part of the irony. Later on in graduate school, uh, funding came from the Cummins Engine Company out of Columbus, Indiana. Funding came from J. Erwin Miller's family. Miller was a remarkable man who was the first layperson to be the head of the National Council of Churches, a deeply committed member of the Disciples of Christ denomination. He helped support and fund Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. But Erwin Miller's expansive view was that all races should live together in harmony and respect, and I'll go further, in loving ways. So here I was in graduate school learning about racism. I learned that it wasn't just an attitude, that it was also caught up in our behaviors. That's called discrimination, when there are institutional ways that people are excluded. And of course, the most obvious one that our nation has dealt with is around education. Very complicated what's happened after after Brown versus Board of Education. I believe that was 1954 or 1955. Um, I wish that the images in the heads of those justices and others had played out. But, institutional racism is a third way. It's not just attitudes, behaviors, but they're institutions. So as soon as board versus Brown versus Board of Education was passed, it took 20 or 30 years for integration to be fully implemented in our public schools, even though the Supreme Court had said, do this with full deliberate speed. I was visiting with a friend this morning who's from the South, and he said he attended a small African American school, and it only took 20 years for it to be integrated into that educational system in the South. What happened in the meantime? Unfortunately, mainly Christians, mainly church people, set up white academies that were established for whites only as a way to protect their kids from having to go to school with these African American people. Well, I can jump over a lot of history. It's not only attitudinal and behavioral and institutional, it's also cultural, and it's that cultural one that has brought us to this point where the cultural language is we don't want wokeism. We don't want critical race theory. We don't want DEI. Most people who use that are using it as out of fear that somehow they're going to lose something. Uh, and the truth is, many of them have already lost. The very same people who are stoking the fear and who are pushing the racism, the very same networks, dare I say it out loud, Fox Television or News Nation, those very same people are happy to use fear to divide us. And at the same time, the church has failed. The mainline churches talk a good game. They say, oh, we want everybody here, we want all included. Sadly, in my own United Methodist denomination, We now have fewer African American churches in Indiana that are Methodist churches, United Methodist churches, than we had early in my ministry in the 1970s. We haven't been very good at including everyone or being included. So let me close with just sharing a few lessons from my research. My research for Project Understanding, funded by J. Irwin Miller, was to see how you might change racial attitudes in congregations. So we went into it focusing on attitudes, and we learned that it was more than attitudes. We also learned some important lessons that are critical to the future. Number one, one of the least effective ways to change racist attitudes is to preach a sermon. I hate that because I love worship and I love preaching. But we found out that just preaching a sermon against racism by itself was not very helpful. Nor was it very helpful to teach a course. I love teaching, but just to teach a course about racism by itself or with worship is nice, but it's not enough. What we learned was that there needed to be behavioral change, engagement with people who are different. I could give you two or three examples. I'm going to give you two. Uh, our research program was set up in 6 different cities: in Atlanta, in Dallas, out in Los Angeles, in the Bay Area, in Indiana, both in Indianapolis and South Bend, and in Chicago. So it was a massive research project. And what we learned was preaching wasn't very helpful, teaching wasn't very helpful. Um, Pulpit exchanges were better, but they still weren't helpful. Choir exchanges, white church, black church, were helpful, but they still didn't make a big difference. So, what was helpful? Well, these are the two places I learned, and there were many more. But one of the things we saw was out in DuPage County, Illinois, the western suburbs of Chicago. What made change in racism, attitudes, and behaviors was when people came together from different racial backgrounds, Black, white, biracial, Hispanic, Asian, and did something together. Sometimes it needed to be something that tested discrimination. So out in DuPage County, we sent people out in teams to try to rent apartments. We sent white couples and black couples and interracial couples and Hispanic couples and interracial Asian white. And then in the evening, we would come together for a meal and talk about what had happened. Now that's when attitudes began to change. Why? Well, you can imagine. The white couple would say, well, we went over there to Sunset Homes and they were ready to rent a place and showed us a couple of nice places. And across the room at dinner, a couple that were biracial, black and white, said, wait a minute, we went to that same place. And they said, sorry, we don't have any places available. And the Asian couple, both Asians, came and said, well, we went there too. And they told us, sorry, maybe next fall there'll be something for you. Now, you want to see racial change, get people to work together to face the realities of discrimination, and then you begin to see change. The second example comes from South Bend, Indiana, where there was a wonderful man who taught in the law school at Notre Dame, Tom Broden. Here I was, a young graduate student. I went to visit Tom and said, here's what we're going to do, and we're going to measure changing racial attitudes or racist attitudes. And Tom listened and said, fine, fine, fine. And then he said, but we're going to do something else. And I said, well, Tom, what did you have in mind? And Tom said, I think, and of course, we're talking about the 1970s, early 1970s. He said, let's invite church women from Catholic parishes and Protestant parishes and Jewish synagogues. Let's invite them to go to sit in the offices of the township trustees. Now, the township trustees are the way welfare distributions were occurring, still are in many ways in Indiana. Uh, I laugh because it's sort of our uh, our manifestation of the old plantation system. You send the poor folk off to get their little bit of nothing. And Tom said, and let's have the women sit in those offices and document all the cheating that goes on. I said, Tom, I'm not here to try to document cheating. What good is that going to do to change racist attitudes? I can still hear his deep guttural laugh. He says, trust me, trust me. And he was right. Within weeks, women sitting in the trustee's office and getting to know the people who are coming to have assistance, and at first looking to see how they're going to rip off the system. But then these women got to know them as people and got to hear their story and got to watch the way they were treated, got to see the institutional racism deeply embedded in how resources were shared unevenly depending on, well, maybe the color of your skin. And within a few months, these women were ready to make a difference. And so they did. They wrote news stories. Some of the women had been trained in journalism and wrote news stories. And if you go into Township Trustee's office today in the state of Indiana, you will see that there is, on the wall are guidelines as to how those who come for resources from the Township Trustees, how they're to be treated, how they're to be equally respected, how they're to be um, documented in terms of who they are, how many children they have, what their economic situation, how hard they are already working. Do you hear me? State of Indiana legislature, US Congress, do you hear me? You can add all the work requirements you want to Medicaid. It's been done in Arkansas. And what they found out, they didn't find much in the way of cheating. A lot of people are already working, some of them working 2 or 3 jobs. Let's be honest. Racism is one more way we continue to have a war on the poor in this country. And the church needs to stand up and say it. After George Floyd's tragic murder 5 years ago, the church decided how it was going to deal with things. And you already know what I'm going to say. The church said, let's preach sermons. Let's teach classes. Oh boy, another class. Let's read a book. Let's do a webinar. Oh, that's what we need, a webinar. We can talk to one another. All the people just like us will talk to one another and say how bad it is and how awful it is. And then we'll go to worship in our all white churches. If we want to have change in the racial makeup in this country, we've got to get to know our neighbors who don't look like us, who don't think like us, who actually have a lot to teach us. The best lessons in my life have come as people who were different from me let me in, trusted me enough to be honest with me. And my Christian faith is stronger because of it. My understanding of this world and our hopes for the future are better because of the diversity that I have known. We are at a point in our nation's history when some evil people are using race to try to break open our nation. What is the attack on Harvard about? Is it really about DEI? Is it really about anti-Semitism? Is it really about critical race theory or wokeism? No, it's about institutional and cultural racism that we still have to address. Now, I'm optimistic. I believe we are going to address it. I have friends right now who are losing their jobs because of the deeply institutionalized and cultural ways the Trump administration and in the nation and the Braun administration in Indiana governance and all across the nation, the way racism is being used as a way to divide and to exclude and to diminish us as a society. But I believe we will prevail. Justice will find its voice. The church will learn that it's not enough just to preach and teach. We're going to need to join hands together, walk in one another's shoes, listen more carefully, find ways for congregations to live more fully, respecting those who are different. It's happening in many places. Small little bursts of hope and light are there. So I dread some of the things that will happen in the months ahead. But as you will hear in another podcast, I believe there's a way for Christians to respond. I believe it's deeply embedded in what we have in the gospel. I call it gospel conspiracy. Conspiratio, to use the Latin, conspiracy, to be with, spiritu, the spirit, to be conspiratorial, and to stand against the evil and to be against diversity, equity, or inclusion. What is this? What kind of silliness is this? How does it in any way comport with our Constitution, or for me, more importantly, with the gospel of Jesus Christ? We'll get through this. The church will have to find new ways to be more honest with itself, but we'll get through this, and new communities will emerge. This is Philip Amerson with the Belonging Exchange and a little rant, a little riff on racism and my belief that while it is an evil, evil reality right now, we're bigger and better than this.